My name is Nils. I'm the IT manager for the Department of Genetics in CALS, and I'll be moderating today's session. We'll have time at the end for some Q&A, so if anybody has any questions, both here in person or via chat, we'll be looking at that, and we can ask our two presenters, Jenny and John. So now I'd like to introduce John Graves, who is an associate internal consultant, and Jenny Erickson, who is capacity lead, and they both are at the Office of Strategic Consulting. So now I will turn it over to Jenny and John for their talk. Thank you.
Excellent. John, do you want to lead us off?
Yeah, and with introductions?
Yeah.
Yep. Hello, everyone. I'm John Graves. I've been with the Office of Strategic Consulting now for about a year and some change, a year and a few months. And I currently hold the title of Associate Internal Consultant. One thing I'd like to just mention a little bit about my background. I have a change management background with ProSci, but that doesn't mean I'm an expert by any means. It just means that I took some certification and I have a paper to prove it. That's really it. Ultimately, you guys are going to be the experts in this here session, and I'm looking forward to talking to you a little bit more about it, and I'm going to pass it to Jen.
Awesome. Thanks, John. Yeah, so our session today is thriving through transitions, right? And the understanding personal dynamics of organizational change. And so John and I are going to kind of lead the conversation, but recognizing, as John mentioned, we're not experts. We are experiencing change like everyone else, and we're hoping to have a dialogue about that today. So with that, I'll talk a little bit about my role in a second, but I wanted to mention just a bit about our office in case you're not familiar. We're an internal, so the Office of Strategic Consulting is an internal consulting office that works with both academic and administrative units on campus to address organizational challenges, advance strategic priorities, improve organizational effectiveness, all that good stuff. And John's one of the examples of consultants that will work with units across campus to help in those core services I have listed there. And I also want to just put a plug in for an upcoming event we have. It's called Showcase. This is the 25th year of Showcase. It'll be at Union South on April 17th. Again, this is an opportunity for people across campus to come together, share some of their work, share some of the ways that they have improved their organizational effectiveness, and highlighting continuous improvement across campus. And so in my role as a capacity building lead, I tend to work more in this professional development space, creating opportunities for growth in these in the areas that our office really engages in. So all that organizational effectiveness, project management, change management, all that kind of good stuff. So I hope to see you this free event on April 17th. And with that, I wanted to just start with a question. And I realize we have some folks online and some folks in the room, which makes it a little bit challenging. If you are online and you have access to annotate, which is that little green pencil on the bottom of your screen, and you can make a check mark, do that. Otherwise, we'll just kind of take, I guess, comments from the audience. But I'm curious about, just want to start with, how do you react to change? Are you more the stick with the tried and true? Are you saying bring it on? I see somebody checked in the middle. I'm not sure what that means. Maybe it means bring it on. I see some folks saying, wait, I need more information, and what's in it for me? And I want to make sure we create opportunities for folks that are in person who may not be able to annotate. I don't know if there's any comments from the room.
Does the room have any comments? I can add things.
Where are you guys at with your change?
More information.
More information. I'm seeing a lot of, wait, I need more information. I think that's fair, right? We're going to talk a little bit about what it means to handle, kind of deal with change when change is happening to you. And sometimes that can be an unpleasant situation. And so needing more information is perfectly a normal response. And I'm going to hand it over to John to talk a little bit about some of his change experiences.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. And so I'm just going to kind of start off with a little bit of a story. And that story kind of reflects a little bit about who I am and the change that I kind of went through. So just a little context. I was a strength and conditioning coach for the NCAA Division I level for 10 plus years. And I knew that I love what I did. I really did. Like it encompassed everything that truly represented who I was as a person. And then as we move forward in life, then life kind of happens. I have my wife, we have a family, and then my priorities and values start to change a little bit. And one of those values that changed for me is wanting to spend a little more time with my daughter at that point in time. So I knew that in order for me to accomplish those values, I had to change something. And so what I did was a 10 plus year career that I once had in coaching that I loved everything about. I took a leap of faith, some may say, and switched careers. And I switched careers into internal consulting, which, if I'm going to be completely frank with all of you, I didn't have as much expertise in. And so that was something that presented when I went through that change, when I made that change, uh, it really kind of made it really challenging it was really challenging for myself ultimately because I wasn't a subject matter expert in what I in this new subject matter anymore. It takes me a lot longer to kind of go through my thought process and how I would handle a situation than it did when I was a strength and conditioning coach. So it had a lot of fears and challenges associated with it that made that leap a lot scarier for myself. And I'm going to be again completely honest with you. A lot of that change, a lot of that newness that I was going to experience was frightening. It was really frightening. And overall, I didn't know what to expect because there was a lot of the unknown about it. But due to my values and where I knew I wanted to go in life, I knew that that was the way that was my path that I needed to take. So I say that story just to kind of set the groundwork and just helping people understand that change is scary. And it doesn't matter if it's big or small. It can be scary for a lot of people. And in my situation, it's very scary. And I'm still currently going through certain fears and certain areas of lack of confidence in what I do now. But I can say that in my time here now, being here for a year and a half, it's definitely gotten better. But I'm not all the way through that change process that we're going to get to as we continue to move forward in our conversation. So if you can, next slide. So what do we have planned for you all today? So in today's session, we're hoping that we can deepen the knowledge of how people experience change. We all experience change, but we want to really kind of dig a little deeper and see what does that really look like? What does that really mean? We want to introduce a framework for navigating transitions, and we'll talk a little bit more about transitions versus change a little later. We want to share some common responses to change. We want to hear from you. We want to get an idea of how you experience change. And then lastly, we want to discuss strategies for overcoming resistance and building resilience. As we start to think about change, what are some things that we can do to help safeguard ourselves as we experience change?
Well, we know, right, that change is inevitable and all organizations must change or adapt to survive. And if you keep doing what you've always done, your organization will eventually become outdated, right? Uncompetitive, obsolete. And we know you have to change to survive. And this change is inevitable and essential. And as John mentioned, it can be really difficult.
Yeah, and as we think about change, I just want to kind of talk about two specific types of change. Before going into that, I'm going to just say this is a big shout out to Teresa Kim. I took her understanding and leading change class, and these were two things that I really took away from it. And I just want to really just kind of point that out. If you have an opportunity to listen to her, it's definitely worth it. So there are two types of change. There's design change, which is a change that you decide to implement. It's a change that a lot of times we as people, if we decide to implement it, can see the value in. And typically, if it's a design change, we typically can see a future state as well. A lot of times, if I think of a change, there's a lot of times I can think of the beginning, the middle, and I could see the end. So that's kind of where your design changes. A lot of times it's a lot of almost, you could say, a little bit more positive feelings sometimes around design change because it's a little bit more around what you envision as a person. Imposed change is the opposite. It's a change that's forced upon you. It's a change that you really don't have a say-so in what is being changed. and it's a lot of times it's change that comes without any input from you yourself, And a lot of times we see this in the workplace. In the workplace, we may be we may be in a building that we've been in for 10 plus years, and then all of a sudden the top people from the top says that we need to move buildings, and all of a sudden that change, you have no input on. Hey, I want to stay here. I've got a lot of investment in this building. This was one of my first workplaces. This is where I've proposed to my wife, or whatever it may be. I mean, it could be a lot of different things, but ultimately, though, it's a place that holds a lot of significant value to you that's just being uprooted from you without any of your decisions. So I really like this image right here because it kind of talks about, you kind of see this guy in a pinstripe suit who we can all kind of assume is the top guy or the big business mind person. And then we have this guy just who looks kind of frightened. And as you can see, they're kind of at the edge of a cliff. And the top executive of that big business suit guy, he goes, you'll never know if you can fly until you leap into the unknown. Now, he has that design change mentality. As you can look at him, you can see the smile. You can see, hey, I see the vision clearly, and you're part of that vision. Whereas when you look at the other recipient of the information, all he sees is a cliff. He sees fear. He sees he's frightened. But there's a real big significance into this metaphor in terms of this is how a lot of times top executives or people on the top don't really include or think about the people who are actually experiencing the change. And so I just want to kind of leave you with that. And lastly, before we move on to the next slide, the last thing I do want to kind of say before we move on is I just want to kind of pose a question to you all, and I want you to think about, but is someone else's design change someone else's imposed change? Is someone's design change someone else's imposed change? So I'm just going to kind of let that sit with you all there for a little bit, and we can kind of talk about it as we kind of move forward through this.
Just briefly, right? What is change? We're using this term a lot. Of course, change is a process. We start kind of in that present state, transitions, move through the transition state, and end in some kind of a vision or a desired state, right? And if we communicate that vision for that desired state, we plan for that, we act, and everything goes as planned, right? Often not the case. As leaders, or leaders tend to start with this desired state, right? But it's natural to think about the outcomes you're trying to achieve and then create a plan to get there step by step. Unfortunately, approaching organizational change in this way can lead to failure. And to understand why, you need to understand the difference between change and transition. So I would argue that we need to spend more time in that transition state. I'll talk a little bit more about that here in the next slide. I want to just briefly talk about the differences between change and transition, right? Change is that external event or situation. It's that leap off the cliff, perhaps, that it's a new business strategy, a turn of leadership, a merger, whatever. And the organization focuses on that desired outcome that change will produce, which is generally in response to an external event. So it can happen very quickly. So change external, it's what we do. It's that outcome focus. It tends to be very visible and physical and fast. Transition, on the other hand, tends to be its internal process. It's more about our identity and who we are. It tends to be invisible, much more emotional and psychological. It's slower, and this last piece is important. It's not optional, it's required, right? So let me give you an example. When you move houses, if you move from one house to another house, that changes pretty quick, right? You were there one day, and the next day you're living in a new house. You made the move. But the transition, the process that you go to adjust to that change, much slower. It's an internal process. So maybe you move from a kind of a hip, cool neighborhood, and you're out and you move out to the suburbs, like where I live, with all the soccer moms. That might have some kind of it may have a little bit of an identity crisis, like how did I end up here, right? It tends to be, like I said, very emotional and psychological. And it's really important as leaders that we're not just focused on the change piece, but also that transition piece. That transition is that people are going through as they are moving through change. Moving. So I wanted to introduce this, this is what's called Bridges transition model. So it came from William Bridges. It's the human response to change, he says, is a three-phase transition process. So what we see here is, it helps the Bridges transition model helps organizations and individuals understand and more effectively manage work through the personal and human side of change. So this model identifies three different phases. And it begins with endings. And you go through a neutral zone and there's new beginnings. So I think it's really important that this model starts with the endings. It's the letting go of the old way and the identity that we used to have. So this is really important as change leaders and as managers. We need to understand that there is loss in change. And often we just breeze over that and don't recognize that people are going through this ending phase or this loss phase. And then ultimately you may transition, and John talked a little bit about that. He's kind of experimenting and trying new things in his role. And then ultimately there's a new beginning. And I want to say that the new beginning may not necessarily be better, right? The change could be a bad change. It could be a rough thing for you or the organization or whatever, but the new beginnings is just a new way of living, kind of a new, you've adapted to whatever has happened and you have a new way forward. And I'll give you just a real brief example. So John talked a little bit about a career transition. I also had a career transition. I worked as a faculty member in extension for 20 years before I came on campus. So I've always worked with the UW, but most of my life has been in community and working in communities. So it's a real difference to be out in community versus on campus. And so in terms of that transition for me, there was definitely some loss. I miss kind of living and working in the same place to some extent, right? I miss some of the freedom and kind of autonomy that I had at that time. It's a little different on campus than it is when you're in a community working. And so those are some of the adjustments that I made, but it was definitely the right time for me to try something new. And so I've been experimenting and been in this role for a while and kind of finding some footwork, but it takes a while and the beginning is a little bit different. The key piece here is recognizing that there is loss and change and don't breeze over it. We often do that. That's the key message here. I'm going to move to the next thing. Oh, go ahead, John, go ahead.
Oh, no, and one thing I just want to kind of add to that too is that I know looking at the picture, you can kind of see that everything is kind of distributed evenly. That's not a representation of time. You may be it may take some people extended periods of time for them to move through these stages. So as we think about these stages, it's not every individual goes through these stages on their own and at their own pace. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there.
Absolutely. That's a great point. Thank you for reminding me, John. Yes. So 100%, this is not a linear experience. They kind of have wavy lines and everyone experiences it differently. I wanted to mention, if you are a manager, that you have a role in helping folks through these transitions. So I like this quote that nothing so undermines change as failure to think through those losses that people face. So if you're a manager and you're leading change, so listen for what people are giving up. Hear that experience. How is this old model serving some? And tends to be the folks that have been there the longest, maybe have really appreciate the old model the most. And how can you address those concerns to help individuals see that there's maybe a different way forward or another way of doing this? So thinking about those losses as a manager is an important process that you can help people through. Empathetic leaders recognize that the change can put people in crisis, I think is my point. And the starting point for dealing with transition is not the outcome, but the endings that those people face. So this is not easy. Letting go, right? How do you help people let go of the old way is not easy. That's why I put a little comic relief in here, right? Of our octopus who's holding on so tightly, but also trying to let go, right? So I understand that the beginnings depend on those endings. And before you can become a different person or let go of your old self, you kind of have to learn to let go. And one key piece is really identifying and acknowledging what is ending. What are you losing? And sometimes it can be very personal. It can be your how competent you were in a position, your relationships that you had. I can give the example of moving, right? So my husband knows every single dog walker in our neighborhood. If we were to move, there's a real loss of the connections that he has with all those dog walkers. So those are the kind of the small things you may not think about, but are a part of the loss and a part of the change. So really acknowledging what's happening and what's changing. Often those are not concrete things. They can be those attitude, assumptions, expectations, kind of those identity pieces are really important, and recognizing that. And expect signs of grieving. When you're losing, when there are losses, there is grieving. And how can you help others let go? Again, are there ways to compensate for the loss? Maybe, maybe not. How do you mark the endings? I think it's really important to treat the past with respect. Some folks really survived and thrived in that past system. And so treating that past with respect is something that's important. Another piece that I think about a lot is clarifying what isn't changing. There's a kind of a new term I've heard about, kind of stability management, really understanding and outlining what isn't changing. It can also be helpful. And the other piece I want to really kind of lean on here is I don't think that helping people through loss or through this process, it can be easy to get stuck there, and I would highly recommend not getting stuck there. So you don't want to drag this out. You want to recognize the losses. You want to recognize that the transitions are people are going through, but you can't kind of get stuck there. You have to keep moving forward. And so I don't want in any way say, hey, spend all your time in the kind of grieving and losses, but I do think it's important that we recognize those losses, acknowledge those losses in order to help people move through that transition.
So we have here the Kubler-Ross change curve. And what this curve is, as you can see on the y-axis, you have motivation and performance. And then on the x-axis, you have time. So as motivation performance goes up, it goes up, and then time goes out. So the Kubler-Ross change curve is a way to identify what each individual is experiencing through change. So these are the 7 stages of change that each individual experiences as they go through change, starting with shock. So what that looks like is that, oh, I can't believe that happened. And then you move into denial. No, this isn't happening to me. And then you move into a little bit of frustration. And it's the frustration around, I can't believe this is happening to me. And then there's that little dip, as you can kind of see in the valley right there, of depression, depression, and the feeling of they just can't get out of that rut. And then as you look and as you start to come out of that valley, you have experiment. Then all of a sudden, after people have dealt with some frustration and depression over time, they start to experiment a little bit in this new environment. And once they start to experiment a little bit, things may start to trigger, or a light bulb may go off, and then decisions start to get made. And you might realize that through your experimentation into the decision stage, that something new that you did really works, and it makes a process more efficient. And then there's the integration, and you start to integrate it all, and you start to create this whole new system for yourself. But ultimately, right here, this is just a way to kind of identify how you as a person may go through each of these individual stages as you start to move through change. So one of the specific things about this stage that I want to talk about is the kind of valley of despair. So as you can kind of see around that frustration, depression, and experiment stage, there's that, it's known as the valley of despair, because this is a lot of times where people can get stuck. This is that rut. And the way it can kind of look is almost like a cynical cycle, right? You're frustrated, then you go into depression, and then you experiment, but maybe that experiment doesn't take off. And then you find yourself back to getting frustrated. And then you just kind of find yourself in this weird cynical cycle, and you just aren't going anywhere. So this is an opportunity, if you notice it, by understanding this curve, if you notice it, people are going through, you can aid your support. You can give them support. And support to me, when I think about change on this curve, looks like helping people through that frustration, depression, and stage by offering your support. Maybe it's just a listening ear. Maybe it's help with understanding a process, but it's somebody who can come in, an external person who can come in and just kind of aid through that. And when you do, you kind of create that bridge of what you see there. And what it is you're not necessarily skipping depression or anything. You're not skipping any stages. What you're doing is you're just accelerating the amount of time someone stays in that frustration, depression stage to that experiment stage. You're accelerating that time frame. So as we look at this curve, to me, this curve kind of represents an opportunity to identify where someone is, and for you as an external person to offer support to help them get through. And as we always say, bridge the gap, and that's what we're kind of seeing here, bridge the situation.
I just want to touch on mindset matters, right? Maybe you're familiar with this idea of circle of concern and circle of influence, been around forever. But the idea is that there are things in life that we can control. That's the inside piece, that circle of influence. And there are things on the outside in the world that we can't control. And where you spend your time and where you put your energy matters. And so on how you think about where you have some control matters. And so I'll just mention that, sorry, I got starting to write that. So folks that have kind of this proactive focus, who are really thinking about where they have influence, right? Their circle of influence tends to grow. When you think about when folks are focused only on the things that they maybe can't control and are getting frustrated, their circle of influence can really shrink. So I'll give just a real quick example of this. So a number of years ago, my husband got laid off. It was really frustrating because he had just won a national award at work. I'm like, what happened? This doesn't seem right. And so the circle of, we spent some time initially for sure in that circle of concern of like, man, this is unfair. I don't like this. I'm mad. I mean, all those kinds of things. It doesn't really get you anywhere, right? So after we kind of went through that initial shock and denial, then we spend some time thinking about what do we have some control over, right? Well, we can think about the networks we have. We can think about the skill sets he has and how we can invest more in those skill sets and build his hireability or whatever. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about what are the things we have some control over, put our energy there. Ultimately, he got hired right away and that worked out great for us. But that's just a quick example of where to spend your energy can have a big influence, and how you think about and talk about change matters. And I saw in the chat, somebody said something about that people are maybe resistant to change. And so reframing it as more of a learning experience, that could be another way of where you have some influence. So how can you talk about this and help people kind of think about this in a way that is maybe easier for them to adapt to?
So I want to kind of talk a little bit about this question right here. In what ways does resistance to change manifest in our work and personal lives? And what are some specific behaviors, attitudes, or situations that indicate this resistance? And when I think about this, I go to ProSci, ProSci being the Change Management Institute, and I think about some of the top reasons they say employees resist change. So I just want to kind of give you all some information from the ProSci organization. And they say the top 5 reasons are: 1, lack of awareness for the reason of change, right? And as we think about that, it seems very simple, but it doesn't happen a lot of times. And sometimes we may think we present the why, or we present the information from our perspective to the employee, and they still don't understand why. And there's that gap we need to, as leaders, kind of decrease. And we want to make sure that people understand the why in terms of the change that's being implemented. The other thing, another reason they talk about is the changing of roles, right? Like if you change roles, a lot of times that's something new and that becomes something that you haven't been exposed to before. And you as an individual who are changing roles know that your process may not be as efficient as it once was, or you know that you may be letting go of the things that you were very capable of doing before. So there's a lot of anxiety around changing roles. And then there's just fear, right? You're talking about fear. You're talking about people don't know what they're about to change into, and because of that, there's a certain level of it's scary. It's not going to be the same, but you don't quite know exactly what it's going to look like. So there's a big idea of fear around that too as well. Reason number 4: lack of support from and trust in management of or leadership. Right. So as leaders are helping these employees through change, they're not, or not necessarily helping them, but as leaders are promoting the change, they're not supporting these employees through the change. They're saying, hey, this is the change, but how can we help with but they're not thinking about the transition. Again, going back to what Jen was talking about a little earlier. And so we want to, as leaders, we want to make sure that we're in consideration around the employees, and that each person or is going to go through their own personal journey of change, and how can we support them? And then lastly, lack of inclusion in the change, right? Like a lot of times it's just, this is changing and this is why. And there's no inclusion from the individuals who are sometimes at the closest to the work. So those are just some of the top 5 reasons that that ProSci kind of pointed out to us to identify why some of the employees resist change. The next one, so what strategies or tactics have you found effective for overcoming resistance to change, whether in your personal life or professional environment? So this right here is just some strategies that this isn't really necessarily backed by ProSci per se or anything like that. These are strategies that are from my personal journey with change. And I always, and one thing I like to think about when it comes to change and some of these strategies, you know yourself the best. You don't need to be a change management expert to have strategies for yourself to help with overcoming changes, is what I'm kind of getting at. If it's what best works for you. And so what I can do is I can lend some of the strategies for myself that I just want to put out there. And one thing I just want to talk about a little bit is for myself is when I think about change, I want to first understand why we're changing. I want to understand the why, because if I understand the why, then it gives me a little bit more context around the change. I want to identify the negatives in my current state. So as I think about the current state I'm currently in, what are the things that are impeding me in this state, and focus on those, and so I can start to think about, which leads me to step 3, is identifying the positives in the new environment. Because if I can identify the negatives and I can identify the positives for me as an individual, it helps create a connection of this should be the things that are going to be moving us forward. And then some quick little tactics, like I like to think about, try to reframe your negative thoughts, like reframe those negative thoughts and try to put a positive spin on them. Educate yourself on what is changing. So when you hear somebody say something about change, really do a deep dive with the information that is available. And lastly, set realistic expectations.
So John, we have about 1 minute left, so I don't know if you wanted to touch on this one and then open it up for questions.
Yes. So the last one I want to just talk a little bit about are, what are your views on the importance of building resilience in the face of change, and what specific approaches do you believe are most effective in fostering that resilience? So these are just 5 things that I believe. Like, first of all, I believe that resilience can be developed and strengthened through proper training, and really training comes from the form of education, and that's educating yourself on what the William Bridger transition model is. I think that helps strengthen the mentality around change and understanding where you are and where you can go through change. It'll help to create a network of close friends as well, establish a support network, listen to understand before you react, ask clarifying questions as you start to, as change is starting to be upon you, and so that you can get a clear picture of what that all the change that encompasses. And then lastly, take a moment to digest. Take a moment to just sit in and let all the information that you've learned about the change soak in. And so those are some of the ways that I think that can help with some of the resilience around change. So like Jen said, we want to give you all an opportunity to kind of ask us any questions or anything like that.
Any questions for John or I? Know we're at our last minute here, but I appreciate your time and that you spent with us today. And I'm looking in the chat. Feels a little too real at the moment. Yes, appreciate that. Sometimes making mistakes is kind of refreshing. Yes. We're trading our current problems for better problems. Yeah, that's probably right.
All right, well,
No.
thank you very much, Jenny, John, for your great presentation. Yeah, does anybody in the room have any questions we'd like to ask? If you just speak up, the mic will do a pretty good job of picking you up. If nobody else has a question right now, I guess I have one. What's a good example of where you've seen this succeed and where you've seen it fail? What tools helped it succeed and what lack of tools helped a change process fail?
You know, I don't have a lot of experience where I've seen a great understanding of the losses of change. And so I think that as an organization, we could do a lot better at that. And so I think we could spend some time at least recognizing. I think that's the key message here today, is that change starts with loss for some folks, right? It's not all just roses on the other side. And so I'm not sure as an organization, we do a very good job of that. And so my message today is thinking about those losses, especially when they're invisible, right? They're these kind of identity type losses that might really be holding folks back. And so recognizing those and helping people to acknowledge them and just realize that this is a real issue that folks are dealing with in order to move through this transition. We're so quick to jump to the change without thinking about the transition. So I would say that I haven't seen a lot of creative examples personally. I think there's a lot of work that could be done in this space.
Great, thank you. Anybody else have any questions? Dave, are there any in the chat that we need to voice out loud?
I've got one question. So, how would you suggest handling someone who is so resistant to a change that they're actively trying to sabotage it?
I have an initial response, and then John, I'll let you take it. So I think, so sabotage is a real problem. I think so part of it is definitely listening, hearing. Sometimes the folks that have the most resistance, the previous system worked the best for them. So understanding again what they're going through and their losses and hearing what they're resisting to is really important. But then in the Kubler-Ross model, you get to a point of decision. At some point, the person needs to decide that this is going to be the change for them or it isn't, and that this might not be the place for them at some point. And that's a very fair response as well. I think the decision to stay or decision to go is both can be good and appropriate for the individual. And this idea that everyone must change isn't, I don't think is accurate. I think it is that everyone chooses to change, and you can choose not to change. John, anything you want to add?
No, Jen, I think you hit it right on the head. And I think you brought up a very important point too, is that honestly, like all of this sounds great on paper, right? Like we understand that like you have the endings, you have the people have trouble letting go of the endings, they go to their transition and then they go into their new beginnings. But realistically, a lot of times that's not always the realistic thing that always happens. And as a result, there does come a time and a decision on that individual, and if they want to be there ultimately. And it depends a lot about, when you talk about sabotage, I agree with Jen, like what I would like to know, what does that really look like? And there may be a conversation, especially if there's already been an opportunities for that employee to voice concerns, and they've already had an opportunity to voice their opinion on things. I think then if it continues, then there probably needs to be another discussion, and that discussion probably should probably would revolve around, does that person see themselves in this see themselves as part of the team in the new state?
I see, Robert put in the chat, sometimes it's a decision to at least give it a try. So if there's ways you can support somebody to, kind of let go of the existing system and at least try the new system, that'd be a great start. I like that comment.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Anything else for us? Oh, I couldn't hear that.
Right.
Sorry, I missed that, whatever that comment was. Anything else for us today?
Any other questions in the room? All right, well, perfect. Jen, John, thanks very much for coming to talk to us. We all really appreciate it.
Appreciate the opportunity. Thank you so much.
Yeah, appreciate you all. Really
Yes,
do.
very much.
And if you ever have any questions around the Office of Strategic Consulting, we also have office hours as well. So if you go to our website, you search Allison Pullman, you can reach out to her, and you can look into scheduling. Maybe there's an opportunity for change management in your organization, but you can look in scheduling some office hours to see if what we kind of offer kind of fits well with what you're looking for. So just wanted to put that out there, and I hope you all have a great day, and thank you for this great opportunity from.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody.